Hello and welcome to Ask the Squiz, our monthly episode where we answer your questions about what's been in the news recently. And on this episode, we'll look at what GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, is and why it keeps coming up in the news, how IVF regulation works in Australia, what Donald Trump means when he talks about the radical left, and a quick check-in on what's happening with the algal bloom in South Australia. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Our first question today is something that comes up a lot when we're talking about the economy and a little bit on defence as well. It comes from Celeste. Can you explain Australia's GDP and its makeup? So what are our biggest industries, how it compares to other countries, and generally what it means, Claire?
So Australia's GDP, we're off to a galloping sexy start.
This will get them in.
But it's a good question because it's an important one. And news nerds, Andrew, like you and me, we really like to get a good sense of this data because it is news generating kind of stuff. It's released by the Bureau of Stats, the ABS, every quarter, and it's a really key economic measure when it comes to the health of our economy. It looks at the total value of all goods and services produced in a country over a year, and it tells us if our economy is growing, if it's shrinking, or if it's stagnating.
It's a big number to get a handle on, both in volume and in importance. And if you think people like you and me are excited about it, just wait until you see that market analysts, the Reserve Bank, the Treasury, policymakers, they love it. They get right into it. So let's drill into it. There are three ways to measure economic output. So you can measure it by production, you can measure it by income, or by expenditure. So the Bureau of Stats, what it does is actually averages all three of those to get its kind of final GDP figure.
Yeah, so when you get to that final number, there's nominal GDP, which is a raw dollar value. That's not really a great way to have a conversation about it, though, because, of course, when it comes to raw dollars, apples ain't apples when you measure periods. Prices go up. Prices go down. There could be all sorts of reasons for that. So the key measure is what they call real GDP. It adjusts for inflation or deflation, and that's where you get the actual growth number from. When you look at Australia, in terms of that real GDP number, last financial year, the value of our economy was $2.8 trillion.
Yeah, and that growth rate was 1.3%, and that means that our economy was 1.3% bigger in the 2025 financial year than it was in the 2024 financial year, and that's a problem because it needs to be about double that for us to continue to improve our standard of living.
Yeah, and this is the conversation that we really want to be having. It's not nerding out over the numbers or these economic concepts. So where the rubber hits the road, probably for most listeners, certainly for me, it's about what do we need to do to actually have a better life, to have better infrastructure, to have safer communities, to have education systems that are accessible and successful, to have a terrific health system, for example. So that's really the number that it all boils down to, and it's an important one.
It really is. And so in terms of what makes it up, services dominate at about 63%. So those are things like finance, healthcare, education, tourism. Mining, which is often talked about as, a major industry in Australia, it makes up about 8% of the economy. Now, that might surprise people. I certainly would have thought, without looking, that it would have been bigger, but it is a big industry in terms of exports.
And I seem to say every podcast we do together, Andrew, that might be because you're a Western Australian. You think you're the centre of the world.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
And rightly so, because mining is a really, really important one, particularly when it comes to international markets and exports. It's a really important one for our economy, the mining industry. Retail, wholesale trade, that's 11.5% of our economy. Construction is 8.6%. Agriculture, which people really, I think, probably in, maybe older audiences that remember ag as being our really, really big economic driver. It's now just 2.5% of GDP.
Yeah, it's a big employer and exporter, but we're not riding on the sheep's back anymore. Small businesses contribute about a third of total GDP, $590 billion. So shout out to, we are a small business, so a shout out to our fellow small business friends. And When you look at all of that as a whole, as a pie, we're a very wealthy but service-based economy that relies on resources and agriculture, exports for trade income.
And when you look internationally, just to give you a sense of where we are on the league table, we're 14th when it comes to the largest economy globally. It's not too shabby for a nation of 27 million people.
No, it's not. And when we mention GDP, as I said before, it does also come up in the context of defence. We've written a lot of stories about US demands about Australia's military spending and its demand for it to be a certain percentage of our GDP. So, it factors into a whole other range of things as well. So hopefully that helps you understand it when it does come up in the news. Let's move on to our second question now. This concerns our IVF industry in Australia, or fertility industry. You might remember particularly there was a story about Monash IVF from both April and June this year. It had 2 embryo mix-ups that landed that company in hot water. And it leads to this interesting question from Kate. How is the IVF industry regulated in Australia, and has anything changed in the months since those stories broke?
It's complicated, this one, and I guess the rules really change depending on where you are.
Yes.
This is our cooperative federalism at play.
Yes.
Again, of course, these systems from federal and state and territory overlapping. So we have this thing in Australia called the Reproductive Technology Accreditation Committee. It has a code of practice. To be able to operate a clinic in Australia, you need to have accreditation from them.
So that's level 1. And the key issue with the Monash story, according to Monash, was that it was human error that led to the problems they had. The first instance, you might remember, just to clarify, that was a case of a couple being implanted with the wrong embryo, later giving birth to a child with no genetic link to them. And what that code of practice that you mentioned says is that clinics have to provide evidence that they are constantly updating and reviewing their record keeping and procedures when it comes to things like making sure the right embryos are going to the right people.
Yeah, and the operators also have to report any issues to that committee as soon as they know anything about problems that are happening. That's just one layer when it comes to regulation. Compared to the rest of the world, IVF regulation in Australia is actually pretty strong.
Yeah, that's what the experts say. On top of the one we just mentioned, there's also a set of ethical guidelines from the National Health and Medical Research Council. Clinics have to stick to that as well when they're doing research or using embryos for research. And then on top of that, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, as you mentioned before, each state and territory has different laws concerning fertility.
Yep. One example of the differences between the states is in Western Australia.
There we are again.
WA, it keeps every podcast we do. I just saying that again. That state has really tough restrictions when it comes to who is able to access it. So single women aren't able to access IVF services in WA.
No, not as easily as they can in other places. In Queensland, which is where that initial incident happened, it happened at a clinic in Brisbane. That state had just last year actually changed its laws so that the health department has oversight over the fertility industry in that state. Before then, it was self-regulated. So that basically means that in Queensland, the industry was pretty much looking after itself.
Yeah, and after that initial story broke in April this year, there was a second incident then in June. So just to explain that one, another mix-up happened at Monash. As you might imagine, questions were really asked about this sort of piecemeal approach, particularly given that Monash IVF, which is a major company. They don't just operate in Victoria, as you would imagine. They're a national company.
Yeah, clinics right across the country. And so in terms of how this is all working, because obviously that's how the regulation works, but then is it actually working as it's supposed to, given that there were 2 stories concerning Monash and then a bunch of other stories that have come out as well. So the Fertility Society of Australia and New Zealand is the peak body for the industry in Australia. And it's been saying for a while that Australia needs a national framework for how fertility is regulated because it's too complex. So it actually did a review of this from September last year before any of these major stories broke. And it said that different approaches in different places leads to IVF being more or less expensive depending on where you live. So that can make access difficult. It also means that the way that records and data is kept differs state to state, and that's not good either because it can lead to safety issues. And it actually said that, fixing this is important to address the declining birth rate in Australia. It gave that as a key reason why this needs to all be changed.
Yeah, but calling for change is one thing, even from the peak body actually doing it or putting new sort of rules in place is a whole entire other ballgame.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second part of Kate's questions, which is, has anything changed since the story came to light?
The short answer to that is yes. So following the second Monash mix-up, the June one, the government commissioned a review into the IVF industry, the federal government. So Federal Health Minister Mark Butler, who is actually the father of an IVF child himself, he said this when he was announcing the outcome of this review. He said in September that every one of the recommendations from that review has been accepted.
Yeah, and the main one from that is that there will be this new body responsible for accreditation of fertility clinics and also people who are working in the industry. And when it comes to January 2027, that will now fall under what's called the Australian Commission of Safety and Quality in Healthcare. It'll look after things as well, like making sure that complaints are heard, that the complaint system is actually robust, and that there's data that's being kept track of.
Yeah, and so the Fertility Society, that peak body I mentioned, say that that's a start, but they've also said that it's not nearly enough. It still leaves the problem of what they said was over 40 different laws that concern fertility around the country in Australia in different states and territories, which is too hard to work through. And they're still calling for those laws themselves to be nationally consistent. That's what they want. They want a federal law that governs everything. But the government hasn't gone that far yet.
Yep, and no doubt if there's another mix-up in the industry somewhere, you can bet those calls will ramp up again.
Yeah, if there's one thing that parents probably need out of the fertility industry and prospective parents, it's confidence that it's all working properly. So up next, we'll unpick a little bit of Trump terminology and we'll check in with how the algal bloom is tracking in South Australia. Next up, we've got a question from Helen from Bawbaw. Hello, Helen. Thank you very much for emailing us. She says, I keep hearing US President Donald Trump referring to the radical left, specifically in relation to violence and in the context of the murder of Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist from the US. Can you explain what fits this description, please?
Very happy to help Helen. Helen's a regular emailer.
Absolutely.
She's been a correspondent for a long time, so we really appreciate her engagement. I guess probably to start, we probably should talk about left and right. I know we've done this in the past, particularly when it comes to elections. So if you're on the left spectrum of politics, generally you like more progressive type policies, socially progressive. Certainly when it comes to things like tax, you're happy for taxes to go up because you can spend more on public services.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. On the right, more conservative, generally want a tighter economy and a focus on defence and that kind of stuff. Very big generalisations, but here we are.
Yeah, and as you said, it's a spectrum. So you can be like slightly progressive, but or mildly conservative, or as we are about to talk about, more radical.
So US President Donald Trump's use of the term radical left has really stepped up in the recent weeks, and it's a very loaded term that politicians from the right of politics use when they're typically referring to progressive activists and movements that they think is quite extreme, on that extreme end.
Yeah, it's the extreme end of, if you imagine the ribbon, the spectrum, it's right at the end of the ribbon rather than in the middle. And the term itself is a contentious one, though. So critics argue that it's often applied too broadly to sort of what are generally mainstream progressive positions. But there are actual far left groups in America. They are a bit piecemeal, but there are sort of, there are anarchist collectives. There are certain cells that identify themselves as antifa or anti-fascist. There are revolutionary communist organisations. They exist, but they're relatively small. This is a conversation, though, connected to incidents of political violence in the US.
Yeah, and when we researched this, we found this really great article from The Economist, which went through the data, and they found that while both left and right-wing violence occurs, right-wing attacks have historically been more frequent and more deadly. That's according to groups like the Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, but that data, like a lot of this sort of thing, is complex. So the Centre for Strategic and International Studies noted that 2025 could see more left-wing incidents, but mainly because right-wing incidents have dropped sharply. So researchers also stress that, look, assigning clean ideological positions to violence is inherently a subjective and very complex thing.
Yeah, they can be thrown around like mud, as some are saying Trump is doing in this case. So as for the specific groups that the president has labelled radical left, he's talking about and has previously talked about Black Lives Matter, those activists, Antifa, as you said, those anti-fascist groups, also the Democratic Socialists of America, which is an organisation. Trump has also labelled mainstream Democrats as being from the radical left. So the boundaries are quite fuzzy.
Yeah, very fuzzy. It's a nebulous definition. And historically, America has seen genuine far-left violence. You might know of the Weather Underground, for example, in the 1970s. But the current data suggests that it's not the dominant threat. Most Americans, regardless of political affiliation, reject any political violence at all. Surveys show that fewer than 10% of Americans support that.
Yeah, but there are radical elements, both in the left and the right, aligned movements. Both want dramatic change to align to their worldviews. So political violence from any ideology is rare but concerning.
Yes.
And the rhetoric around who's responsible often sort of obscures the actual data, showing that Americans just want a peaceful society.
Yeah, a blame game sort of coming into play is not helpful. So that's an explanation. I mean, in the short version, you can have someone on the left wing or progressive side of politics. The further left they are, the more radical they might be. But whether that applies to the people Trump is talking about is a difficult question to answer.
Indeed.
But we've done our best. One more thing before we finish. Let's also just check in with another story that we've actually previously talked about on Ask the Squiz. This is the toxic algal bloom that's going on in South Australia. So we've actually received quite a few bits of feedback from some of our South Australian squizzes that have been saying that, particularly for people who live by the coast, it's actually causing some real damage and life upheaval for them.
Yeah, and life-changing stuff too. So people have had to move, change jobs, get medical attention. This algal bloom has been affecting the state for about 6 months now. And as we've talked about, that algae can cause mild issues for humans. For some, though, obviously they're having more extreme reactions. It's deadly to animals as well.
Yeah, and no one knows when or if it might go away. So Professor Mike Steer is a name worth noting. He is a marine scientist in South Australia, and he is leading the state's response to this. He gives weekly updates. I've seen it compared to sort of how we got to know our public health officials during the COVID pandemic, like he's giving those sorts of regular public updates on it.
Yeah, right.
And he says that this is now an unprecedented event, speaking of a word that we all heard a lot during the pandemic.
Yes.
So he says this bloom is now in the top 10 in the world ever in terms of how long it's hung around.
I don't think that's a record that we want to have.
No, it's very bad for a lot of industries.
Yeah. So when it comes to how long is it lasting, the impact it's having on health, jobs, the economy, it's only going to be more and more concerning as time goes by. As it happens, just yesterday, the ABC published a really detailed piece about the impact that it's having on South Australians now that they've hit that 6-month mark, and it's a really good read.
Yeah, and we'll keep checking in with it both on Ask the Squiz and on Squiz Today, but it is one of those ongoing stories, so we thought it was worth checking back in. I would definitely recommend that article. It's really expansive, lots of pictures as well to give you an idea of what this actually looks like if you haven't seen it. So we'll link to that in the episode notes today and a couple of the other articles that we've talked about as well. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next month with another Ask the Squiz. You can email us anytime with a question you've got at hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.